Well, hey there guys, and welcome back. On this week's show, part 2 of our scale model build. There's a lot of information to be had on this week's show, and there's a lot of things that we need to get done, so I don't want to waste too much time talking through the beginning of it. So let's get right into it. Where last week we left off making those leaf springs, let's look at what we need to make now in order to be able to mount them to the frame. Well, the way that these drawings work is you really have to pay attention to what goes where and think about the process that you're going to take in order to mount everything. And we can see here is our leaf springs here and here. It also shows them in another drawing over here. But we need to look at what it is that connects everything together. Our leaf springs are glued to our frame. Our axles here are glued to our leaf springs. And in between our axles, we have the drive lines, both the one between the two rear axles and the one that goes forward to the transmission. Now, these drive lines are installed using our differential rings. So they will get mounted onto our rear axles. Now you see where everything is connecting here. So if you were to just glue in all of these pieces here, you might have trouble getting in the drive line as well. Even though you can't see it along this drawing, if you look up to this drawing, here's our front drive shaft that would go to our transmission, which is presumably or imaginary over here. Right here is our driveline hanger, which we will also need in order to get this driveline mounted in. And that, when you flip through, is actually 2 more pages ahead right here with the driveline hanger. So what we're going to need to make actually is the driveline hanger. We're going to need our 1/4 inch dowels for our drive lines and our driveline number 2 up here. We're going to need to make these U-bolts right over here, which gets a little tricky, and I'm going to show you how to do that when we get there. The only tricky part is because they're so small, but we'll get to that. And we need to make these differential rings. So let's start off by making these differential rings. Well, these pieces aren't rocket science. I've drawn out some crosshairs, used the circle template to draw a 5/8 outer diameter, and I've center punched the dead center of these crosshairs, and I'm going to drill a 1/4 inch hole as it says here on the drawing. Then I'm going to cut the outer diameter on the scroll saw, and I know it won't be perfect, so I'm going to cut just outside the line. Then we're going to do something to fix it up, and I'm going to show you that right now. We've got the 3 pieces rough cut, and isn't it convenient that that 1/4 inch hole that is in the middle of them also coincides with the diameter of my pen mandrel for my lathe. So we've chucked them all up here in the lathe, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to take a piece of sandpaper, mount it to a little square block of MDF, and I'm just going to gently sand this square to the edges until I reach my 5/8 diameter. Now, of course, if you don't have a lathe, don't fret, because a 1/4 inch dowel chucked up in your cordless drill will do the exact same thing. I just use this because it's what I have and it's what I like to do. So let's get these shaped down to our 5/8 of an inch. And in no time at all, we have those 3 differential rings made. And you can see how nicely centered those 1/4 inch holes are. That's because, of course, that became the center, which we spun them on the lathe and sanded them down to size. You'd get the same results with a cordless drill or even in your drill press, guys. So those 3 parts are now made, and we can now move forward, and I think we're going to make that drive shaft mount that was a couple pages ahead. And there we have the driveline hanger made, and you can see that it is quite a small piece, and there is no kind of magic going on as to how to make this. It's just careful marking on your stock. And for this, I cut this particular dimension, the width of the piece, which is 7/16 of an inch. I cut that on the table saw using push pads, etc. And the rest of it is cut on a scroll saw. The hole in the middle, 1/4 inch brad point drill bit, while the stock is still square, to make sure that you have plenty of original stock to work with and you're not trying to drill into this tiny little piece. And that's it, guys. It's not rocket science. It's just a different method of making these pieces. Just take your time and everything works out just fine. If you're not that good on a scroll saw and you can't get that sharp edge, no problem. Cut outside the line and use that paper, the sandpaper that's mounted to the 3/4 MDF, and sand up to the line to square everything off and make it nice and straight. And Incra T rules, which you guys have seen featured on my show on more than one occasion, they are really your best buddy when marking this sort of stuff out. So now that we have that done, we need to make those U-bolts that I pointed out, which are those little tiny pieces, and I'm going to show you how to do them. Well, in order to cut small pieces like this, first you need the original stock to cut those small pieces. And these have a specific profile, and you can see that here on the print. And what's the best way to do that? Well, the way that I go about it is I use a bigger block. And the first thing that we want to do is we want to cut that angle, in which I figured out it to be roughly 17 degrees. So I set the tilt of my blade to 17 degrees, and leaving 1/8 of an inch at the top of that block, I cut a curve at 17 degrees. And once that's done, now you want to cut the width of the piece. So you reset your blade to 90 degrees, and using that same block up against the fence, fire it through at the 1/4 inch thick. You can see what you get with that. And I know it doesn't look like much, but then you need that 9/16 of an inch height. Again, set the height of your blade, make sure it's at 90 degrees, set your fence to 9/16, and run that piece through again. And you end up with the block with a piece taken out of it, which is now a length of the pieces that you need to cut these U-bolts out of for your axle. Now, it may seem like a waste of stock, it may seem like a lot of fussing around, but I still got all 10 of these, and that's the goal at any point in time when woodworking, is to do it as safely as possible. So now that we have that stock cut to its profile, now we need to cut a bunch of pieces that are only 3/8 of an inch wide. And how the heck do you do that? Well, a miter box with a razor cut saw and that sort of thing, that would work just fine. I prefer to use the table saw, and I've made a little jig for cutting small parts. So let's head over to the table saw and I'll show you that jig. Well, this here is my small parts cutting jig that I've made, and I'm not going to get into how to make it, not on this show anyway. Maybe I'll make another one on another show, but for now, this is what I use to cut the smaller parts on the table saw. And it works in conjunction with my miter fence. It mounts to the miter fence via a couple 1/4-20 bolts, and the nuts go into the slotted track of my aluminum extrusion of the miter fence. And it slides rather well, and you can see that the blade here comes up into the fence, and this is the cutting area. Now, the way I set it up is a little different, and I'll just show you how that works as well. Well, here we are at the jig, and here is the stock that we need to cut into 3/8 of an inch wide pieces. Now, this here is nothing more than a stop block, and it is set in the back with a threaded knob that screws into this. It's not anything special, but what I do to set this up is I have a 3/4 inch setup block, and I also have a 3/8 of an inch setup block. I place those here against the fence and I slide them up to the outside edge of the table saw blade. I then bring my stop block up. Don't put a lot of pressure because you'll deflect the blade and change your measurements. So just a little bit of pressure, and then I tighten down the stop block. Now here's where the secret of this comes in. You no longer need this 3/8 stop block, because if I place this tight up against this 3/4 stop block, or setup block rather, I know that whatever gets cut in here will now be 3/8 left, because that's what was in between the blade and the setup block. But you don't want this in here, because what happens is if you have your stop block, say, tight up against your stock, and you run this through, that blade is going to tear this thing out and fire it back at you like there's no tomorrow, because it will bind against the stop block. So this is where the secret of this comes in, that you place the 3/4 stop block in place, put your stock tight up against that setup block, then remove the 3/4 inch setup block and make your cut. And when you do that, it'll give enough room in here that it's not going to bind and fire back. So let's cut one of these and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Now you may have noticed how this piece did shoot a little out of the way, but there was plenty of room here where it didn't hook the blade and didn't go firing out of there at some crazy speed. I have had them hook like this, even with this setup, but it's a small enough piece. It didn't hook, it didn't grab. My hands are well out of the way, so the piece got lost. It just fired off or got destroyed. It doesn't happen too often, but if you're concerned about it, add an extra inch, inch and a half, add whatever you want over here. Just remember to move that setup block that you're using out of the way before you make the cut. So I need 12 of these now, so I'm going to cut 12 of them, and then we'll get back to the assembly of the frame and the leaf springs. Well, I would like to do a dry fit now of the leaf springs, the axles, all of that stuff. I will still have to cut the drive lines here, but that's okay. I'm not concerned about that just yet. Right now, I just want to do a dry fit. Here is the problem. As I said in part 1, I have never seen one of these plans yet where things or measurements were not missing, but I've always been able to figure it out. And this one is no exception. Showing the position of the axles here, they show them over here, they show them up here. You can see the leaf springs right here, and then there's a gap between them, but nowhere in any page of these plans can I find any measurements as to where to mount these or where to mount the front ones. So now we're going to get into a bit of confusion. And I did say that these are a 1-to-1 scale plan so that you can take measurements. So I ended up actually shifting over all the way to page 9 of 9, the last page of the plans. And we can see here, if we look between the fenders and the frame, right in here, we can see our axle, which is right here, and we can see our very rear axle, which is right here. Now, we can take measurements at this point from the back of the frame, right here at the cross member section. We can take measurements from that to the center of this axle and then to the center of this one. We will have to place center marks on each one of those pieces, but we will be able to reference that and be able to get a measurement. I'm not going to give you that measurement. If you guys are doing these plans, I mean, you can scale it off and figure it out. That's part of the fun and part of the enjoyment of doing these is figuring out problems. Now, here we have, how about the front? We have nothing to measure off here, and there is, again, no measurement to be found. However, if we go all the way to page 1, the very first cover page of this entire thing, what we can do is we can scale a measurement to the center of this hub right here. So we would be able to take a measurement from the center of this wheel all the way to the center of this hub here of this wheel, and that would give us the measurement of the center of the axle for the front wheels. It's the only way I could figure out to do these measurements, and the only place that I could find any reference point to get that measurement. So if you're following along and you're using these plans and you're confused now and have no idea how to mount them, I've just given you the way that you could scale off these prints and mount these parts. So I'm going to do the dry fit, and once I get it all sat in place and dry fitted, I'll come back and I'll show you what we're looking at before I glue it into place. And using center lines and scaling from the drawing, we have a dry fit of our rear axles and our leaf springs. Now, of course, the U-bolts are in there as well, but they're just sat there, as is everything else. We still need to mount these rings, which will go at the inside edge of each of these differential pieces with the drive shaft going between. And then for the front drive shaft here, of course, another ring here with our bracket mounted further up along the line to hold that longer piece of drive shaft all the way to the front. Not that big of a deal. Be sure that you take this in stages, guys. Don't try to glue it all up at once. Glue the leaf springs in place using your square to line everything up. Remember that the rear leaf springs are actually 1/16 wider than what the frame is. So you will have an overhang on either side. Make sure that it's equal. That's all. Make sure everything is squared up. Make sure it's lined up. Once the leaf springs are dry, then you can glue your axles in place, making sure that you square them up to the side, because a crooked axle is going to cause you big problems down the road for this vehicle being able to roll on its wheels. So let's glue all this together, and we'll glue the front ones in place, again scaling off the drawing. And once all that is said and done, I think that we can move on from the suspension section of this little build. Well, if you've been following along and if you've been gluing things in the right spots and figured out your dimensions, you should have something that looks like this, with your drive shaft running up through the middle and 3 axles in place with 6 sets of leaf springs and all that jazz. I'll just pan away from me and show you a bit of a still shot of it. And at this point, you might be wondering, where do we go from here? Well, the next step, like I said, these pages are chronological, so you would move on to the next page because we've pretty much finished all the parts on this one, with the exception of the front hubcaps, which for some weird reason is on page 2. I don't make the wheels until the very last. You don't need this model rolling around while you're trying to work on it. But we're going to move on to the next page. And I'm not even sure what parts are there, but I think it's things like the bumper and the backlight assemblies and that sort of thing, as well as gas tanks and gas tank mountings. Well, following over on page 3 of the plans, we're going to move on and start making some of the other pieces to mount on this frame. And where I'm going to start is with the fuel tanks. Now, they're calling for an 1.5-inch dowel, but I really don't like using any store-bought product on these builds. So I will actually be taking a piece of stock over to the lathe and turning it till it's 1.5 inches in diameter, and I will be cutting it to the lengths that we have here. I'll be using a parting tool to be placing these grooves in the fuel tank, and then afterwards we're going to drill the holes in it that we need for the filler cap. As well, we can see that there are some mounting pieces that need to be made here, and it's not a difficult process to make these. What I will be doing is transferring these particular patterns by photocopy and then spray adhesive onto a piece of stock, and these will all be cut at the scroll saw. Once all of the pieces are done for the fuel tank, I will be mounting those to the frame, and that's where you will join me next, is when we're mounting those to the frame. As well, while I'm already at the lathe, I will be making the air tanks as well, which in this case, it looks like they are a 1/2 inch diameter turning. So I will be turning these at the lathe as well, and also making the mounting brackets for them at the scroll saw. So in just a little bit, I'll see you back here. This stuff isn't rocket science. It's not difficult to turn these little pieces here. You really don't need a video on how to do it, but we will come back and I'll show you how to get the measurements to transpose these and get them mounted onto your frame. Well, here are the pieces turned. We have the 2 fuel tanks and we have the 2 air tanks, and I've also turned these fuel caps here, and in the plans they actually call for axle pegs, but like I said, I try to not use any store-bought parts in the build. I prefer to build my own. So now it's time to cut the brackets for our fuel tanks, and for that what I'm going to do is stack cut them. And I have one pattern attached here to the top of this piece of 3/16 maple. And I'm going to use some hot glue, and I'm going to glue 4 of these together. And once I get them glued together, I have the center punch here punched out to be able to use a 1.5" Forstner bit, and I'll drill down to get the perfect circle right there. You don't have to do that. You can cut them freehand. They'll fit just fine, but I kind of like to do it this way. And then from there, I'll cut the rest on a scroll saw, and then we can put those brackets together. Now, something that I want to point out, if you're going to turn your own pieces, you want to be careful when you're measuring them out and marking them out, because otherwise you end up with something like this. And what this is a failed piece, because the guy on the lathe didn't measure well enough, and he ended up with one that was a little too short and had to turn a second one. So just something to keep in mind. Measure twice, cut once, or, you know, as the saying goes, darn it, I cut it twice and it's still too short. Just remember here that when you're putting the hot glue onto your pieces to stack together, that you want to get the glue into the waste areas. You don't want it in the areas where you're cutting. So there's just something to keep in mind. As well, what we're using for this is we will use the flat edge of our pieces as the flat edge of our bracket. It just makes sense to use what we have, and that way you don't have to worry about cutting that edge there perfectly flat. It's time now to mount the fuel tanks, but you, once again, just like when we did the leaf springs, you don't want to do everything all at once. So, and just like when we did the leaf springs, the plans are missing the measurements to mount them, and they don't tell you where they go. However, I was able to find sections on the drawing that you could scale off of them and get a measurement for these brackets. So we're going to mount these first to the frame. So just be sure to check your drawing and know where it goes, get your measurements, and know exactly how this thing gets mounted, which will be just like that. So we're going to apply a little bit of glue to this, and once we get the glue there, we're going to use our friend Mr. 2-inch square, and we're going to bring it up here, put it on the mark where we need it, square it up to the frame, and glue it in place on both sides of our truck frame. Now I'm going to tell you that neatness counts when it comes to this, so make sure that you get in here with your little cotton swabs and dampen them with some water and clean out any squeeze out that you may have in here, because if you don't get it cleaned out, it will stick out like a sore thumb later on when you're looking at the final product. So just be sure you get it nice and clean, get rid of all that squeeze out, and let this dry up. Don't try to mount your tank prior to having these dry, because these turned little pieces are a little heavy for this one little glue joint to hold if it's not completely set up. So we're going to get these mounted, and then we're going to put the tanks in place. And once your brackets are dry, of course, you just glue your fuel tank and then your air tank in place. Now, I mounted the brackets for our air tank in the same way that I mounted the brackets for the fuel tank. There's no difference. As well, you didn't see the process for making the brackets for the air tank because it was identical to doing the brackets for the fuel tank. I stack cut them using hot glue to keep the pieces together, drilling in this case a 1/2 inch hole through and then cutting out the brackets. So mount your tanks, get them all in place, and once you get that done, then you can move on. And I think what we're going to move on with in this case is the 5th wheel assembly. There is just one thing that I want to point out about mounting the fuel tank in particular, and that is that once you flip it over, you want to try your best to make sure that the filler cap is straight up and down. So don't just lie it on its side like this and put your tank in place. Make sure you flip it over and have a good look and make sure that this is like straight up and down so that it looks right when the whole model goes together. Well, I know that I said I'd like to start in on this 5th wheel assembly here, but I think there's a few other small parts that we can make first instead. And that would be, for starters, these little nubs here. Like, these will represent the bolts that would hold the brackets for the leaf spring assemblies. Now, they call for a 3/16 inch axle cap for that, but as I said before, I don't like to buy pre-made parts, so we're going to make our own for that. As well, I'd also like to do these steps on the tank and get those out of the way, and that way most of the frame assembly is completed. There's also here a chassis engine lift piece that glues onto the front of our frame, and it's just a square piece. You don't need any kind of video on how to do that. The way to make these brackets is the exact same process as the brackets that we made when we made the ones for the tank. So that's no different either. But to make these little nubs here for our leaf springs, it's a little bit of a different process. So what I'll do is I'll show you how I make them, and you can decide what you want to do. So making these little nubs instead of using the axle caps is a pretty simple process of chucking up a 5/16 inch dowel into a cordless drill and then turning the drill on and sanding the end here to give it a rounded profile. Now, it doesn't have to be super rounded, just a little bit, just to take off that sharp edge. And then once we're done that, using that same process that I showed you for cutting small parts with that small parts cutting jig, I'm going to take this over to the table saw and lop off 3/16 of an inch, and that will be our piece. For this here, I believe we need 12 of them. So that's the process. Round off the one, cut it off. Just remember to keep your dowels long enough so that your fingers aren't too close to the table saw blade. And there you can see we have those pieces mounted there for the brackets that are holding the leaf springs, as well as our air tank here, and also our gas tank with the steps has been mounted. And of course, don't be afraid here to cut some pieces that will help you in doing the spacing of these steps and allowing those setup blocks or your homemade setup blocks to sit there while the glue sets. Now, I'm a little concerned here because of the gas tank caps that I did make them so that they were facing straight up. And in looking further along in the plans, it looks like that may interfere with the body of the cab or the walls of the cab. And we're going to find out if that happens a little later. And then it looks like we may be into a little bit of problem solving as far as how to get around that. I'm not too concerned at the moment. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. So there you go now. Some great progress made on today's program. And that would be all the time that we have for this week's show. Unfortunately, the show is only roughly about a half an hour, so we don't want to take it any further than this for this week. Now, you may be wondering, or there may be those of you that are wondering, what the heck, we've got 2 half-hour episodes and we hardly have anything done. Guys, the amount of time that it took to come along this far in the build is about 18 hours so far, just to get the chassis and the tanks and the leaf springs and those sort of things put together. We're talking 18 hours of work in the shop. So this is not a quick process. So being able to cram it down into 2 half-hour episodes with explanations actually isn't that bad. Hopefully we're going to move along a little quicker as we progress, and I don't have to give you so many tips as I've said before. Anyway, guys, we're going to move ahead next week with this build. I hope that you're enjoying it. Thanks for tuning in, and I'm going to see you again next week with yet another woodworking video.